the wealthier you are, the less likely you will have children. If you want to become a mother, and fathers is not that different, you have a 2/3 likelihood of it happening, 1/3 likelihood of unplanned childlessness. There's something else more powerful. Women are having fewer children than they want. This is not about forcing, encouraging, coercing people to have children they don't want to have, not in the slightest. This is about enabling people to have the children they do want to have.
Stephen J. Shaw, what would you say is the topic of your work?
My focus is on global birth rate decline, particularly in low birth rate contexts. So why are birth rates falling globally? Why did it happen in some countries around the same time, but not others? Why is it now happening basically in countries where 75% of the world's total population live? I come at it from a specific angle I'm calling structural demography, basically finding the structures and patterns that are common across all of these nations.
Yeah. And you say across all nations globally, how bad is this birth rate issue?
Yeah, and to put into context, I mean, I do look at it as an entirely global, humanistic phenomenon now. And some people will be surprised and say, well, no, in sub-Saharan Africa, people are still having larger families. And that's true. But if you look at the trend there, so let's just cover that one. In sub-Saharan Africa, mothers since 1980, every 15 years are having one fewer child. It's down to around, I believe, just over 4 now from maybe up to 7 or 8 back in the 80s. And it's straight lining down in Africa. So we can see the same trend there. That's where Europe and the States and much of the rest of the world was perhaps 80 years ago, 100, 150 years ago. So it's a timing matter. So yes, it truly is a global trend. And how bad this is, well, that's a matter of debate, but it's going to create a lot of problems for a lot of people and a lot more problems than I think people imagine. And, part of my research is to increase awareness of this because a lot's going to change and we need to be aware of it.
What are those ones that you're seeing that maybe people don't imagine?
The underlying factor that emerged during my research and was published in Nature Portfolio last summer, 2025, it was the realization that mothers, since around the 70s, maybe 80s, have been having the same family size, mothers. So once you have your first child, almost no matter what country you live in, you're having a young woman today is having the same family size as her mother's generation and quite possibly her grandmother's generation. And this applies, people perhaps would know, perhaps the most famous low birth rate nation is Japan. It just happened to be that Japan was one of the countries that entered into this trend early. And I don't know, perhaps because people, find Japan an interesting, quirky country, they assume this is a Japanese issue and that people in Japan just don't want large families anymore. That's not true at all. Families in Japan in the early 1970s are the same size as families today. There's been no change. And that holds true in almost every nation. So the most surprising thing to me, and I think to most people, are that this is not about family size at all. A few other surprises I could throw out there, but I'll name that one for now.
So if it's not about family size, what's it about?
Yeah, this is where it gets a little bit, we can be simple. It's about people not having children. It's about childlessness. Mm-hmm. It's about those people who, for whatever reason, remain childless for life. So you would look, just to continue talking about Japan for a moment, you would find that in Japan in the, say, early 70s, effectively 95%, give or take, 95% of women became mothers. Oh, and by the way, we talk far too much about women in this context. It's only because we have birth records, maternal records for so many nations in such detail. I certainly wish we'd had the same information for men, and we just don't. But we can assume it pretty much applies to men too, that young people in the 1970s, 95% of them were having children. And that's common across Europe, across many, many nations at that time. What you find today is in Japan, it's more like 40% of women are not going to become mothers. So 95% has gone down to 60% of people having children. So 5% not, now 40% not. But what's the most interesting thing from my structural research is this wasn't a gradual trend at all. It happened through one or two instant shocks. So you find really between 1974 and 1977, suddenly a delaying of parenthood, and suddenly these pathways that led to lifetime childlessness is really occurring in a very narrow period of time.
So delaying of parenthood leads to lifetime childlessness?
It increases the likelihood of it. And
How much? Because I hear a lot of people say, well, if we wait until our 30s, it'll be fine, or there's always IVF. How much does delaying it really matter?
Yeah, well, this really, in my own, just to give you some context here, in my own research now, I work with data for around 40 nations and hundreds of millions of records of births, and particularly on mothers. And I really don't bother now looking up the name of the country or what year it was. I just look at what's the average age that women are becoming mothers, because that alone determines almost all of the total fertility of a nation. Not quite all, but almost. So it turns out that age is everything. And to put it in context, across these 40 nations, I'm yet to find a country where a woman turning 30 without a child has more than a 50% chance of ever becoming a mother. But actually, if you look at individual nations, it's notably lower than that. So a common age, it's certainly in European context, would be a woman would have 50% chance at age 28. And in Japan, a woman turning 26 has only a 50% chance of ever becoming a mother. But I want to be clear about something, and then we should talk about the US too. But this isn't to do directly at this point with biology. You see in the data that biology kicks in. It's a sliding scale, of course. The later you leave it, the more chance biology will become a factor. And but we see really that's starting to have a significant impact by age around 35. And biology is not my expertise, but you can certainly see that prior to that, a notable majority of people who start a family go on to have the same number of children. That's how we know that, really. The people who are starting a family at 33, 34 are just as likely to have two, maybe three, as those who start a little bit earlier. So what is it? What is this missing factor that means that a woman turning 30 without a child has only a 50% chance? How do you square those things? And this is really the missing piece in our knowledge, in terms of the common stories that we read about so much these days. This topic 3 years ago, when my documentary, the first part, first came to light, almost nobody was talking about this in the US, UK. It was a very quiet topic that you might read about once a year. But now, of course, it's being written about and talked about almost daily in some contexts. And I have to say, I roll my eyes at much of this, this discussion, because people think it's to do with their economy, it's to do with work-life balance, it's to do with gender balance, it's to do with the weather. I don't know. It's none of those things, and that'll surprise people. I'm very happy to kind of go, particularly the economic one. We should probably talk about. So again, what is it? Well, this missing piece is to do with settling down, and you may say, well, of course, that's obvious, but no. You see, the longer you delay settling down, the less likely it will ever happen, and we see this in the same pattern. Going back to, well, some of the data goes back to the 30s, but mostly taking data from the 60s, 70s across 40 nations. Not all of that history, but a lot of significant history. And you can see that once people start forming a family, meaning having the first child, later, mathematically, the less likely it will happen. So then you come down to, okay, so this isn't a birth rate crisis. This isn't a, what I call unplanned childlessness crisis. It is those things, but it's actually a crisis related to delayed parenthood, because that alone is not just correlated, but highly predictive, including future predictive of birth rates. So maybe that was a long answer, but delayed parenthood is the heart of the challenge we now have. And if we're ever going to solve this problem, if we're ever going to come up with policies to help address this problem, if we ignore delaying a parenthood, the chances of success are, I would say, very limited.
So biological fertility measures matter, and those do decrease with age, but we have much more of a global cultural pairing and committing to becoming parents issue. Is that the distinction?
Yes, that's right. So you can see, I think on the biology side, I might give you a fairly convincing answer to that. Well, one part is that those people who do start families up to around mid-30s are still going on to have 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 in some cases. So the timing of the first child biologically does not seem to translate into the cause here, or otherwise mothers would be having fewer children. But if you look at very few nations, South Korea being one, where women are starting families, I think 33.5 is now the average age that a woman in South Korea is having her first child. Then suddenly you do see a change in family size. Women in South Korea today, based on 2024 rates, are on a path towards having 40% of them are on a path to having only one child. So if current birth rates were frozen in time, 40% of mothers would have one child in South Korea. Most other nations, that number is more like 20%. And Japan is 20%. The US is probably around that number too, for one-child families. So there is evidence that actually when you delay things as a nation to a certain super late point in time, biology then becomes an extra challenge. But yes, there's something else that kicks in much sooner. And I was very uncomfortable when I saw this data, because it challenges at the idea of autonomy, that, we can choose when the time is right to start a family, because I can see from the data we absolutely cannot. You're either, I call this a curve, because the actual timing of motherhood and fatherhood forms a near perfect bell curve by age. And it's almost perfectly smooth, and that hasn't changed in any of the data I've seen. It really challenges the idea of autonomy, that people can suddenly decide, maybe one group having children right after high school. That still happens a little bit, but you might find a small bubble there. But you don't find bubbles there. And you might think, well, others might, after college or after grad school and up school, another bubble, but aren't bubbles there. And then you'd really think, to bring in IVF, you'd see a little bubble, at least, in late 30s, with all this great success from all these IVF and egg freezing technologies. But you really don't. There's something else more powerful governing this, in effect, that basically says, as a society, as a nation, if you are hardwired, in effect, to make the social norm starting families late 20s, early 30s, you're never going to realistically be able to get birth rates, back to certainly where they were. And but I'd like to actually make another comment here, because, I get a lot of criticism. I'm sure there's comments below this. We'll see comments coming in, and I want to put something on the table very clearly here, that in academia, it is very well established that across the developed world and further, women are having fewer children than they want. This is not about forcing, encouraging, coercing people to have children they don't want to have, not in the slightest. This is about enabling people to have the children they do want to have. And to put one strong piece of evidence towards that, last year, the UN published a report, the UN FPA, Population Division, effectively. And the title was The Real Fertility Crisis. That was the headline of the report. And this was a landmark report. You can go and you can download it. The Real Fertility Crisis. Now, the UN, until recently, I think it's fair to say, was primarily focused on higher birth rate nations and ensuring that people in high birth rate nations have access to birth control and, knowledge effectively to better plan their families. Last year was the first time where we saw that really start to turn at the UN level. The real fertility crisis they described is people not having the children they want to have. And that was based on a study in 16 nations, including the US, including Nigeria, including many other nations that are not just high income nations. So the real fertility crisis, according to the UN and according to my data, is people not having the children they actually want to have.
Mm-hmm. And Stephen, you talk about autonomy when we like to have assumptions about autonomy, and yet this is a coupled event. And so it seems that it's hard to be autonomous when you are depending on another person, and we live in a society where people are moving and pairing and stuff. You have a metaphor. You compare it to a dance. I think that would be helpful for people to understand. Could you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is my latest research. I hope to be able to kind of get this paper published during this year. So the term that's used for two people effectively deciding to start a life journey together and potentially have children is pair bonding. And pair bonding is an established concept where two people, to the exclusion of all others, decide, we are the right for each other. And, we can call it a couple. But once you start having children, it kind of becomes more serious. It's not like you can reverse that decision very easily. So the pressures on pair bonding around the timing of having a first child are quite critical. Now, and you've already alluded to it because, the idea that we're autonomous sounds great and we all like to think it. And we all probably want to believe that around when the time is right to settle down, that probably there will be a choice or two or three of who might want to settle down with you. We just assume that we see it in the movies, it happened to our parents. So why would we think it would apply to us too? The reality is that two people making that decision around the same time gets harder and harder, gets less and less likely, I should say, the longer you wait. So the analogy I have is of a barn dance. I think these happen in some places in the world, but I like to think of it going back to probably my parents' generation, maybe around the 1960s, when certainly there's no internet, there was no mobile phones. And you can imagine a small town where the only way to meet people was that one dance every Saturday night. And the dance would open from, let's say, 8 o'clock until 11. And from 8 o'clock, people would be gossiping and catching up and saying, did anyone bring their cousin to town? Have there been any breakups? And slowly dances would start. And you might find, I guess, sort of halfway, 9:30, that the dance floor is, busy. There's energy, there's vibrancy, there's what I call vitality happening. And then you might find that things start to fade away. Some people might leave together. Some people might, give up and go home. Some people might, it's much less likely that you let's say, get someone's phone number, which is probably what you're trying to do, in the last 5-10 minutes of the evening. So you can imagine this evening would start slowly, it would get intense, and then it would fade down, and then you'd have to wait until the next week. So if you imagine that's a little bit like dating when most people are having children, let's say in their early 20s, because there's an intensity, there's a moment in time where couples are forming. But just to stick with the analogy for a moment longer, imagine now the dance club owner decides, well, this is great. I'm going to open longer. I'm going to open at 7 and I'm going to close at midnight, 5 hours instead of 3. It's going to be great. But what they have overlooked is that the population of the town hasn't increased. You've got the same number of people stretched over 5 hours. So what's going to happen? Well, some are going to go earlier in 7. Some are going to have dinner first. Some are going to have dinner later. And by stretching this out, there's never a moment in time when you can look around and think, okay, from this room of people where I might have to make a decision because the girl or the guy I was interested in is suddenly dancing with somebody else, I need to start thinking quickly. You're never certain that everybody's in the room at the same time. And maybe just when you are settling, thinking, well, okay, this person could be perfect, you turn your head because someone at 10 p.m. comes through the door you hadn't seen before. And then the person you are with notices that you're looking at somebody else and the whole thing falls apart. So this is what I call the vitality curve, that as you stretch out the timing, whether it's of a dance or the timing when, the years rather, when we might hope to find a partner, because it's less likely that people are on the same page at the same time looking for what you're looking for at that moment. Actually, not only does the peak go down, but the overall likelihood of meeting someone, to get their phone number after a dance or to settle down and marry and have a child, mathematically decreases. And that's the heart of my current research, showing how mathematical that relationship is. So I guess, an interesting aspect that would merit further research, but it's quite obvious in the data. If we go back to the early baby boomer generation, you had, the Second World War. You had the period where younger people were not able to so easily, certainly, form, families, start families, get married, date. And you see a form of delayed parenting there, where after the war, there was a sudden increase of what I call catch-up births, family formations that probably would have happened sooner and then settled back because you hadn't really changed the societal norm of when the right time was to get married. You just had this blip. So you see some interesting things like that in the data, but there was still a curve then. The challenge we have is that because all of these societies, and I have not seen a single exception, because all of these societies have delayed parenthood to now 30 is the norm. 32 is quite common in parts of Europe. US a little bit younger in some contexts, but all getting later and later and later. How, the question for me, really, the question that keeps me awake at night, well, there's several, but the one that scares me most is that I don't know it's possible for society to re-engineer itself to make the social norm starting children younger again. It's not enough for one or two people to do it. You need entire groups, arguably subgroups of societies, to say we are going to make this social norm. And then it's a case of, well, how does education fit into that? How does career development, given we're all competing with each other in one context or another for for income, for salaries, for job security, for promotions. So this becomes a much broader societal issue than just incentives or even awareness alone to increase birth rates.
Yeah. Stephen, I'd like to stay on your dance metaphor because I actually love ballroom dancing. And so I go out to a lot of places and I see these dynamics play out. And it's fascinating. There are places that they'll say, we're going to go from 7 to 11:30. And you know what? It's free. So people will just come whenever they feel like it. And those events tend to have a lower energy. And it is, like you said, it's almost mathematical. You can sense it. Whereas some places, it's 2.5 hours. There's a cover to get in the door. So people show up. They want to get their money's worth. And at those events, everybody's there at the dance floor to get their dances in, to get their reps. And then, when it's over, it's over. And you can feel the energy. Like, you don't have to question whether someone is taking a break or whether someone's really there or they just happen to be in the area and it's free and they just walked in. And I wonder what you think about dating apps and all of this, because when I go to the place that goes 7 to 11:30, it's part of a much bigger venue. So there are people who have nothing to do with the dance, but it's free and they just kind of wander over and you don't even know if they're really interested. They're just kind of looking and lurking. And so the whole energy just gets sucked down. And it seems to me that that's what a globalized dating app system does. That it just, you don't know who's really there. It drops the energy, this vitality, this willingness to commit that you talk about. I mean, what do you think about dating apps and this analogy any further?
Well, dating apps certainly haven't helped the situation in any way. You can see it in the data. There's no, there was no sudden improvement in the likelihood of starting a family. I guess to call them dating apps, if you want to go on dates, perhaps they're useful for that. I can absolutely say though that what they are not is apps that kind of are geared towards family formation. Yeah. I think there probably should be apps out there that make it very more restrictive for people wanting to date with the idea of actually settling down and starting a family. Perhaps that would be a useful way to kind of filter out some people. But you see, the apps have become part of the social mix of ways to meet people. But I cannot say that without apps, things would change very much at all. And this is where it can be challenging because we can think of these things. What if people weren't using apps? What if? But unless we make the societal norm, I mean, I'll put a number on the table, but I think unless the societal norm becomes starting a family as a woman at age 25 again, that birth rates will not recover. And there'll be a lot of gasps at that. Some people will say, how's this older male, able to say this? I'm just talking mathematical. I'm just looking at the numbers, the deep patterns from 300 million mothers in 40 nations around the world over decades and seeing how it all links together. And you cannot predict birth rates recovering without the age of motherhood coming down to around that level. So do dating apps make the matter worse? Look, I'm sure we can be doing a better job about creating apps and creating ways to connect people. But my point is this. Well, maybe here's an idea. If there's a dating app that you could only use, everyone could only use 1 month a year. So there's intensity. Okay, the app's it's going live again. It's let's make it springtime. 1st of April, the app's going live. Let's call it April dating. And like everybody's talking about this crazy, but everybody goes to the app and everybody intensely wants to find that person, have 2-3 lunches, whatever, and find the person. That might work. It's the intensity that we need to, whether it's online or offline.
Mm-hmm. So even if we cut out dating apps, which do perhaps dissipate the intensity, that we still live in a culture that doesn't have the intensity. And as you said, mathematically, we have to push it younger. As long as, even if we had more focus, but it's in your 30s or something, it's still too spread out to be effective. Is that kind of what we're getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish I was wrong about this. This is why it keeps me awake at night, because it'd be very easy to think, well, we just need to re-engineer things to make it easier for those who want to start families in the early 30s. Let's stick with this and just find ways to fix it. But, again, coming back to the empirical mathematics of it, that just seems effectively close to an impossibility. So we need to find ways to make it easier to have children younger, and a lot of people will push back saying, well, we just got to accept then that's it. Societies are going to fade away if that's true. It's not quite as negative as that. When I first started showing screenings of, I live in Tokyo. When I first started screening the early versions of the film pre-COVID times, to small groups of 10, 15, 20 people, international and Japanese in different contexts. I realized 2 or 3 things that gave me hope. One was people want to talk about this. So they watch the film and then they talk, and then they realized they don't even really want to talk to me about it. The filmmaker in the room looking for feedback. Well, they did a little bit, but intense conversations were happening amongst young people about their lives, their future, societies, what has to change. And I thought, well, this is good, because if young people aren't moved by this, then we have a real problem. And in many, many, many cases, they absolutely were. Not that there was agreement from everybody clearly, but a fire kind of was started, I believe. And I think we're seeing that more broadly in society now. But the second thing was this. A notable number of young people would hang around and did want to talk to me, and were visibly frustrated, confused, even distraught at the idea that society was not geared up so that they could study, get their degree, get their training, get in the career path, and then have family. It was like, Steve, what do you mean I might not have the family I'm going to have? This is everything that society is pushing me for. And, I'll share 1 or 2 comments. One was a very quiet Japanese young student, I believe 21, out of college, who said nothing throughout a Q&A afterwards. But as she left at the end, she just whispered to me, "You changed my life." And that was moving. I'm not sure exactly the context of that, but I imagine she decided to prioritize having family in a way that she probably hadn't thought of before. Another was a student in the UK at Cambridge University who, I didn't know, watched the film after part 1 became online, and then invited me to Cambridge to screen it. And I learned that after she had watched it, she spent 2 weeks just walking around aimlessly, angry. She was 25. She just completed her studies. She was expecting to focus on career for 5, 10 years before even thinking about family. And just the anger with society saying, so the point here is that we have been fooling ourselves, not to point fingers, so let's make it collective. We're all fooling ourselves that nature, whatever you want to term it, that nature is okay with this idea of drifting into our late 20s, early 30s, and still being able to meet someone, settle down, start a family. We have taken this for granted, you might say, and we have, taken it for granted, but also in some cases been encouraged to take it for granted. And there's some people are quite happy that we're having fewer children than we want, but that's a side topic perhaps. But we have allowed ourselves to fill up the years when we are most fertile, certainly women, but men don't get off scot-free either. And I hope we can talk about men a little bit here. But certainly in the case of women, the years where it's by far most likely that they will meet someone and settle down are now filled up, with studying careers, and in an essential way, because otherwise there's great vulnerability, economic vulnerability, particularly on the shoulders of young women. So we've created these societies where there's little choice but to get in the career path as high as you can, as well educated as you can, and to stay there as long as you possibly can before jumping off. Jumping off means just being distracted, taking some time off, and starting a family. It's seen as a risk. It's a vulnerability for several reasons. So we have a lot to think about to re-engineer that. That's not just a case of, okay, well, let's just tinker with it. That means reinventing a lot of how society works.
Stephen, you mentioned culture, and maybe if we had some sort of way of like an app where people were very clear about their intentions and things like that. I have heard of religious specific dating apps. and things like that.
Huh.
I wonder, you've been all around the world. What have you seen as far as religious groups and religious intention and maybe moving up that age, improving birth rates, things like that?
Yeah, and there's a lot of research available on religiosity, and it's not my specialization, but I'm certainly happy to quote the general consensus, I believe, which is that religiosity, whatever religion that is, but religiosity does result in higher birth rates. Now, my assumption, I haven't done this analysis, but I think a reasonable assumption I would say is that that's because people in religious circles are probably settling down earlier and possibly therefore also having larger family sizes, perhaps because they're starting younger. So it certainly seems the case. See, it comes back to the concept of societal norms again. Well, what do you mean by a societal norm? In most nations, there is a clear societal norm that operates in an exceptionally homogeneous way across geographies, across social strata, in terms of the timing of becoming a parent. But maybe this is a good time to start talking a little bit about the US, because the US isn't like that. The US, on one side, is actually quite an outlier here. I spent 15 years in the US, West Coast, East Coast, Midwest. So I have some experience. But when you look at the timing of births across the US, you start to see a exceptionally well-defined non-cohesiveness within the states. And what I mean by that is we talked about this vitality curve, how the average timing of having a child in a cohesive society follows this curve, and that curve has got stretched out. Well, the US has got multiple curves, not one. And the cleanest one I have seen, and this is where I have had access to data on men becoming fathers too. We have that for the US in some contexts. If you look at Asian Americans, you find that Asian Americans have a near perfect vitality curve if you isolate them on their own. And you find that the average age of motherhood is similar to some East Asian societies, so early 30s. And you find a very low incidence of motherhood. So you could take Asian Americans as a cohesive society out of the US, and you could almost say, well, this is just like a country on its own. And then you look at now, there's a lot of potential for analysis. If there's any researchers out there who would like to dive deeper into this, I would certainly lend my knowledge and expertise to help get people started, because this is, I think, going to be a potentially very rich way to analyze cohesiveness in America. And there may be different reasons for wanting to do that. When you look at white people, you see more than one curve. You find some marrying younger, some marrying or settling down rather to have a family later. And certainly, African Americans, Black population, you see a significant number having children very young, and then some having children later. So to me, given the uniformity of this curve across cohesive nations, you would look at the US and you say, well, this could be a geographical split. To your point, it could bring in elements of religious differences that create different cohesive societies. That's certainly possible. The core point, though, in the US context is that these are groups that are mostly not dating each other. Of course, there are exceptions, sure. But mostly, we can see that Asian Americans are dating themselves. Mostly at a younger age, African Americans are dating themselves. And in the middle, there's a bit of a mix, so it's less easy to be clear about that. But I suspect generally that's true. And why this is particularly interesting to me is that, so here you have a society that has been able to function, in some context function, with multiple, almost competing sub-societies with different societal norms in the same context. And we really don't see that. We certainly don't see that persisting for long elsewhere. It might be the case in Israel. I intend to do that analysis at some point soon. It's been a while since I looked at Israel, but I know you do absolutely see different cultural norms there, including amongst those who would be deemed more religious. So it's not a direct answer to your question about religiosity, but it is to say that I do think religiosity, it seems to have been shown convincingly in the literature that the more religious you are, the more likelihood you're going to become a parent. Quite possibly, I believe, larger family you're going to have. But it also seems that subcultures, perhaps religious ones, perhaps in the culture of certain societies in the US, and perhaps in Israel, can in some way remain somewhat independent of the broader societal norm. And that might mean ultimately, generation after generation, nations shifting towards becoming countries of higher religiosity. So, yeah, that will be interesting.
Yeah. So, Stephen, it seems that the core issue here is that we can see that families are actually staying about the same size. People are still having multiple children, things like this. I see this, a lot in my own friends and family, that people who have kids tend to have a couple of kids. It's not just the one child family. Now, there are many more people nowadays who are not having any children, but we're planning to. That is unplanned childlessness. How are people dealing with unplanned childlessness? What can be done to address unplanned childlessness? And this might be a point to come in about men too. I know you mentioned you wanted to discuss that.
Yeah. So, when I started my research, let me go back a little bit. So it's 10 years ago, almost to the month, I started my research. I'm an independent, I can now say academic. I'm a published, peer-reviewed, independent researcher. What drove me to research this topic was a belief there had to be some common patterns between falling birth rates in Italy and Japan and Germany, given they started at the same time, and then later in maybe the UK or France, US. So it's like, okay, the timing's interesting, but there's certain clusters here. Why might that be? And I made the decision to film this. Initially more likely to use, I thought I was going to use the film just to record the interviews from my own research, because I wanted to go out and talk to people in these countries. Data alone wasn't going to be enough. I felt I needed to actually hear some stories about why was it, that Japan and Italy went through the exact same trend at almost the exact same moment in time. And I thought that really was going to be the entire focus of my research. And I did find common patterns, quite strong ones, it turns out. And those are now, in the literature, and I think being picked up more and more, that, as you call it, I call it unplanned childlessness, it has really is a common factor. Now, what I then got pulled into about halfway through, and I ended up I planned to spend 1 year making the documentary. It took 9 years to complete the whole project. And instead of going to 4 or 5 countries, I went to 24, including Africa and India and other higher birth rate nations, or once higher birth rate nations, we might soon say. About halfway through that, I came to the hypothesis that the whole thing was driven by unplanned childlessness. And I thought, well, when I go to future countries, future interviews, I want to talk to some people who have had kids, a bit older than my normal demographic. I was targeting younger people, and some who don't have kids. And let's hear what they say. And I happened to be in Latin America when that started. And if you watch the documentary, you'll see not just Latin America, but you'll see quite a few women open up about their dreams of having family and getting really quite emotional in a way that I hadn't ever planned for. This was to find common connections. I'm a data scientist, and suddenly these tears were coming out, and I realized, I'd already realized, okay, this needs to be made into a documentary. There's enough personal stories being told. I felt, okay, this isn't just for me and my research. But that was a moment I realized that these stories of unplanned childlessness, the term they often use, is grief. Grief for the children they never had. And my realization was that these people are telling me a story on camera, often that they've never told anybody else, not even their close siblings or friends. And of course he didn't, suddenly start getting emotional from the start. It's just when I walked through and asked them, tell me about your life story. Did you have a plan for a children? And they walked me through those years. And then you could see emotions starting when they had to explain how they got to where they were. Now, when I say they, there will be people listening, watching to this who are in that category, and my heart goes out to them if they are also feeling a similar way, and many do. There are support groups. So when I say they, I've had a lot of time communicating with getting to know people in these support groups for people who had hoped to have children. And, in that context, that's where I really came across the best stories from men who'd wanted children. Because maybe I should have done a better job of talking to men too, but it seemed to be, as I went around the world interviewing in total over 230 people, young and older, about their lives, it seemed to be that men were much more willing, or women were much more willing to be open about this topic. But I came across a support group for men, and it's included in the documentary. And it's heartbreaking. I would almost say, because I got to know some of these people quite well, really quite well, and they exchanged a lot of detailed emails and even extended interviews. I did an extended interview with one man who'd planned to have a family, quite a successful man. He just never met the right person. And it was by far the most emotionally draining interview I had ever done. It went on for nearly 2 hours when most of my interviews would be 1 hour. And in the end, he asked me not to include it. Yeah. I agree. Yeah. It was a profound journey through this man's life, how he had always assumed that he'd be a father one day. And the pressures on him, career-wise, finance-wise, always meaning that there was never that right time for him to settle. And then the slow, I think he's probably around late 50s, was when I interviewed him. The realization throughout his 40s, coming to terms with it in his 50s, that he was not going to be a father. And, so the idea that men are, isolated from this is completely false. It may be, I think I've seen numbers that overall more women desire family than men. Yeah, that's certainly possible. But can men also reach the same levels of grief? Yeah, sure. And I would encourage anybody listening in that category to go and find some support groups. There's come to birthgap.org and you can message me and I'll put you in touch with some.
Mm-hmm. And Stephen, you say that, maybe it's slightly more women than men, but still this is a huge, huge number of people who experience this unplanned childlessness. I mean, something like 80% of the decline is people who are unplanned childlessness. Yes.
Yeah. So, this topic gets a little bit blurry. So I'd be delighted to cover it. And it gets blurry for a number of reasons.
And when you say this topic, you mean?
Yeah. Whether the trend towards not having children is planned or unplanned.
Okay.
That has become an intense debate on social media. And, there's clips of me on TikTok and YouTube saying things, watched millions of times. I saw it here. And there's other podcasters out there like, Chris Williamson, whose show I've been on a couple of times. Stephen Bartlett, they were talking, and that's been retweeted and tweeted by some younger women who don't want kids, saying, this is misogynistic. Even talking about the subject is misogynistic in some way, or anti-feminist, et cetera, et cetera. And I think some people have that agenda. But I can share my experiences on that. But just putting that aside for a moment, let's just cover what the data says first of all. So, the gold standard in terms of research into family intentions, I would say almost globally, because there's nothing quite like it, is run by the CDC in the US. It's called the National Family Growth Survey, or National Survey of Family Growth. It's been going since the 70s. Every few years, 2, 3, 4 years, they interview between 6,000 and 10,000 women, now men too. And until very recently, it was an interview always in people's homes. So people would be pre-screened to make sure that there's a good demographic representativeness for the US. And they would then sit down with this person in their home and ask the most personal information. Some of the very personal information is asked through an online separate survey. So there's some, but we know a lot about young people. It focuses on I guess people under, I think it's up to he's 49 right now, and family intentions is one of those. Now, if you go back 20 years and look at people who either have or want children, women, that number 20 years ago was something around 95% of women in the US of childbearing age either had or wanted children. Now, that's fallen a little bit. It fell maybe to around 92%. The most recent, I'm going to call it comprehensive survey, which was 2017 to 2019, showed that it had fallen a bit further, but it was still 90, or I think 91% of women either had or wanted children. But there's another element to this. If you isolate women into their most fertile years, or that societal norm when people are on the dance floor and it's kind of, whether it's intense or not, that moment when it's most likely for people to become parents, those numbers go up for either having or wanting children. And then they fade back down a little bit after. I guess some people just recognizing or accepting that, well, they're not going to have them. Or 49 now. We still ask 49-year-olds, do they want to have children? And probably not surprising at that point that it just may not be a feasible thing lifestyle-wise, even if it were technically possible. I mean, do you really want to be a grandparent, in your 90s? So there's all sorts. That's why it becomes complex. But I want to make the point that whilst I can't even say this is a trend downwards. It might be. We'll have to see. But it's a very slow trend. And in simple terms, we can be confident that 90% of more of women, either have or want children. So 10 women today, if you take today's 15-year-olds in the US, and you were to freeze the birth rates as they are right now in the US, effectively we're heading towards 4 out of 10 of those 15-year-olds would never become mothers. 6 would. And from the CDC trends, we know that actually of the 4 that don't become mothers, 1 wanted to. That's the 1 out of 10 overall. Wanted to remain childless, rather, to be clear. And 3 would have wanted to be mothers, and that's unplanned childlessness. So if you look at, there's 2 or 3 key numbers that come out of this, to keep it as simple as possible. Of the 9 out of 10 women who would want to become mothers, 6 out of 9, 2/3 exactly, do become mothers. So those young people today in the US, if you want to become a mother, and fathers is not that different, you have a 2/3 likelihood of it happening, 1/3 likelihood of unplanned childlessness. And if you look at those people who would become childless, if these rates were frozen over time, of the 4 childless people, only a quarter wanted it that way, 3/4, almost 80%. To your number, which is a heuristic I use and other use to basically is unplanned childlessness. And, I say this is do I call it murky area? I think it is when you see some of the backlash. When I talked about a Cambridge student who invited me to screen my birth documentary, a Cambridge student organized event, free tickets for students, for anyone, I think university related. I was flying in from Japan for a Q&A afterwards, and it was advertised. And as a result, there was a small, but there was a street protest by some students that women didn't need to be told to have children, that it was a personal decision, and there should be no documentary for students. Now, the university gave ground and cancelled the screening. So, I'm in that club, I guess, of people who have been cancelled.
Yeah.
And what actually happened, a professor, I think upset at this, managed to find an alternate venue for a smaller number. I think there was about 20 of us who went to some chambers inside the university secretively. I mean, I'm talking about coded messages being sent out to people to meet. I believe it was at a tree nearby to randomly be, yes, absolutely, and up these stone staircases through the rear entrance to this building. Well, we had a Q&A that lasted for 4.5 hours. And these were men and women, young students from, or actually around the world, for 4.5 hours wanting to talk about this topic. And there we had it, just prior to that some students, one was quoted, the protesters, one was quoted in the student magazine, Varsity, a medical student, saying literally that the quote was, "We don't need Stephen Shaw or birth gap documentaries to help us decide whether to have children or not." But here was the greater majority thinking, well, wait a minute, this could happen to me. I want to hear about this. And the publicity for the documentary, it got some global media attention. Actually, it helped take through the roof at the time. Now, that was a sort of my realization. And maybe that was a bit of a shock to me at the time that, gosh, I'm going to have some resistance from some people here who are uncomfortable with this. And the bigger shock came when some of the childless, not by choice community I'd interacted with, the women who had wanted children, who were opening up, some in the documentary, started being attacked online by women who never wanted children, basically telling them to keep quiet and enjoy their lie-ins in the morning. And I thought, my goodness, this is women attacking other women just because they wanted children. And this became so vociferous that some of those women said, look, I'm not, going to be in the public domain anymore. I don't need this. If you then play that through to what's happening even in recent weeks and months, where there has been a fueling of the movement, the girl who famously came up with 300 reasons for not having children. Yeah, those are her 300 reasons. She's perfectly entitled to share those reasons why she wouldn't have a child with anybody else. She's perfectly entitled to even persuade people, I guess, that some of those may or may not be true. But she and no one else is entitled to lecture people, to coerce people, or not to respect people who do want children, given that the majority, significant majority do. But yet on social media, this has taken off to the point, I think, where people believe that most childlessness today is by choice, which is really, it's not true and really unfair to people who've lived that unplanned childlessness experience. And Well, I've got two things to conclude on this topic. I have no evidence other than my own, but I get a sense, and I did interview people in a documentary who do not want children, never did. 5, 6 women who, are now in their 40s, 50s, never wanted a child, quite happy. I would say that there's a reasonable likelihood that those people who never have the desire to the child, if they've really thought about it and they've really confronted, do they or not, probably never will regret it. And I think it might almost be black and white, whether you want a child or don't want a child. Now, that's controversial because there's other theories as well. There's other theories that it's mimetic. Once you try and mimic somebody else, when you see someone else being a parent, you suddenly get the desire. It's not my expertise, but it does seem to me that those people who just never, ever really had any desire will not regret it. But further than that, my second point is that I think that fuels a misunderstanding in society that those people who never, ever had the desire for children at all simply cannot understand those who do have the desire for it and the compromises they would have to make to their life, just cannot understand it. And perhaps vice versa too. Certainly vice versa. And I think that might be fueling a lot of what we see online by people writing these lists of here's 300 reasons. Sure, why not 3,000 reasons? Sure, let's think of them all. Maybe we've come to this blunt confrontation, because I think it is that, between voices who are adamant that they need to tell the world why not to have children for some reason, and those who are perhaps like me, sharing some realities for the majority who do. Maybe it's just lack of understanding. Maybe it's just inability to comprehend the differences that we clearly have.
Yeah. Stephen, for those many people who hit a point of unplanned childlessness, there would be some theoretical backstops. There's IVF, which we started to discuss, and I think we can point out there are just limits to that technology. So there's no guarantee there. The next backstop that people might see, and that I had assumed, was adoption. Being an American, growing up in America, I saw a lot of international adoption. My friends adopted from China, Guatemala, that sort of thing. What did you find about adoption nowadays?
You're right to raise this because we should cover IVF too. But on adoption, first of all, I don't often talk about this, but we did cover adoption in the documentary. I went to an adoption agency in California. I went to another one in Chile, in Santiago. But as well as that, I interviewed families with adopted children. I met people who had been adopted. I met people who had chosen that they want to adopt rather than having their own biological child. And I think I saw a fair spectrum, but the picture of adoption today is very far from the picture of adoption 30, 40 years ago. And again, we're very slow to update our mindsets based on recent information. Adoption is certainly one of them. And in several ways. First of all, international adoption has become much more difficult than it was in the past. I believe this started more than 10 years ago when I believe a Russian child was treated exceptionally badly by a US family, and through the media, Russia decided to close its borders to international adoption. So that's just not possible. And that's not just because of the war. That's gone back really quite some years now. But then the same thing started to happen across the world. So Guatemala shut their borders. We interviewed a woman who had been in the process of adopting an infant from Guatemala to the US when the law was changed, and suddenly that was no longer possible, which she found absolutely heartbreaking. But then African countries started the same thing, and what had started maybe from concerns of welfare for children really then accelerated for other reasons. One of which is low birth rates. Latin America really is experiencing a wave of ultra low birth rates, and they have so many people in their own nations who want to adopt their own children that the idea of exporting a child really became something not only unnecessary, but really unpalatable to many. And then, African nations as well, they decided that it was up to them. I'm certainly talking Ethiopia, and I quite a number of substandos, certainly Kenya as well. Nations that decided, we're going to take care of our adoptees rather than, go through this process of having foreign parents. So the idea of international adoption being there, it just isn't. I think the numbers have fallen by something like 80 or 90% for international adoptees when I last looked at the data. But then more generally, the idea of adopting an infant, let's say in the US, but it's effectively any country these days, certainly any more developed country, because of the low birth rate, because of delayed parenthood, there's simply fewer infants available for adoption. So in California, I learned from an adoption agency there, for every infant that becomes available for adoption in the US, I believe there are 15 parents waiting to adopt. 15 to 1. 70s and 80s were a different era. Not only were birth rates higher, but so was, I guess, teenage pregnancies and unwanted pregnancies. And maybe there was more of a taboo over, having a child outside marriage. So I think that fueled a lot of the ideas that, we can just adopt. I had so many people around the world saying, if I don't have children, I'll just adopt.
Yeah.
Like you kind of go down to the store and say, okay, show me a list of adoptable children. It doesn't work that way. And then there's one more element as well, which complicates it even further, which is that some states, I know a little bit about Washington State in the US, have shifted to the idea that infants will not be adoptable, children will not be adoptable until they're, I believe it's around 8 years old, that they will go through care homes, that the system will look after them, perhaps through foster parenting, until age 8. And why is that? Well, the idea is that the birth parents may change their minds. There may be a relative from the birth parents' families, the biological parents' families, who decides to adopt. The parents may get over their drug addiction and may be suitable parents. So we'll just hold back these children and put them through the care home system until age 8. Well, that's a very difficult situation for, I'm not sure I could say, there's any perfect solution there. But I know from talking to people trying to adopt an 8-year-old child and have them become perhaps as integrated into your family as you'd want them to be, it's probably not what most people are imagining when they think of most people are imagining, well, if I don't have a baby, I will have a baby through adoption. It's not a myth. It does happen, but it's rare. Mm-hmm. Now, shall we talk about IVF a little bit too?
I'd like to stay on adoption, if you don't mind. It's particularly interesting to me because I just didn't know. So to just kind of piece it all together, we have international adoption, very low rates now, much lower than historically. States where you cannot adopt newborns, you're going to have to wait until they're 8 years old. So that decreases the numbers. We have a lower birth rate in general. So that decreases the numbers. And then you are competing potentially with 15 other qualified families to adopt. There are private adoptions. I looked up numbers from the CDC on that in America, but that's just a few thousand a year. So that is extremely rare too. So it seems that the adoption scene is beyond saturated and extremely difficult. Are there any things that we're missing here?
Yeah, there's one further thing I learned during this. If you intend to adopt,
Mhm.
It's a very impersonal experience.
Impersonal.
Yes, because what has to happen in the run up to that even being possible is every aspect of your life is interrogated.
Mhm.
You know, the authorities, whoever they are, will come into your home. They will search everything, every drawer, every piece of clothing, everywhere. And I believe that's done randomly more than once. They want to make sure that you're not, hiding some drugs, I guess, or, what. But it goes further than that. They will want to know literally. I'm not sure it's down to reading emails, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did. So they will know everything about you. And I know that process itself was unpleasant just because of the intrusion of these people who are there to know every detail about you just so that you can have a child. So the process itself is more complex and takes more time than people expect. And the numbers as you've laid out more simply than I did, are not good at all for people hoping to adopt. It does happen, yeah, but the numbers are dwindling compared to what it was.
Mm-hmm. So it seems we have a bit of a coordination problem then too in America, because there's this idea particularly when very young women get pregnant, that if they were to put the baby up for adoption, the baby would just end up waiting and waiting, and it could be terrible. But in fact, we have this tremendous demand. Is that accurate too? I mean, to get perspective there.
I think that is. I suppose if you look at it from the perspective of if you have a child at any age, and for whatever reason you prefer the child were brought up in an adopted family, you will have a long list of potential people that you could adopt through agencies, and I think generally managed in a professional way. And there's another actually interesting aspect to this. You can elect whether you remain in contact with the child or not, whether that's a requirement at all. And so can the potential adoptive parents. Some parents, many in fact, prefer there to be no contact or no contact until 18 years old. I think that's really quite a difficult decision for all involved at that point in time. But certainly as a potential parent who would, I guess, give their child up for adoption, there's not a shortage of people wanting to do it.
Wow. Stephen, what would you like to add about IVF?
Yes, so IVF has been around for quite some time now, decades in some cases, in some countries, and long enough for us to be able to look at data and come up with some conclusive information about, how effective it is. And this is an area where you can look at it from 2 points of view. And, certainly IVF works. Perhaps we all know some people who have tried IVF, perhaps successfully, and, a child or children have been born. And that's great. And those are the stories we tend to hear and focus on. Probably rightly so, because those are success stories. But if you're a person going through IVF, there's another statistic you're probably going to want to know. And that is, well, what's the likelihood this is going to be successful? And I can't here give you an answer to that, but I know it's a very disappointing question. I can give you an answer from someone in my family who went through IVF around age 40, 39, 40, and was told that the likelihood of her having a successful IVF after 3 rounds was 15%. She had assumed it was 85%, because never ever heard that it could be so low. No, thankfully it was successful. But she couldn't have another child though she would have wanted to. She was told for a second child it would have been a 5% likelihood. Now, those likelihoods will vary based on health, based on the age and the other factors. So, and also, it's not just age now; it's the age of the egg, because we have this thing called egg freezing. So you can actually, at that age, potentially use eggs that were frozen when you were 25, and that certainly can increase likelihood. So, nonetheless, though, we don't have a lot of data on egg freezing yet that I'm aware of to be conclusive about it, but it seems to be certainly true that it's, no matter what technology you use here, it's far from certain that you're going to succeed. But the area that I'm really interested in is actually not so much that. I'm really interested at looking at this at a national level, societal level. And so what my expectation was that when you stand back and you look at data for hundreds of millions of mothers, literally, that you would be able to look at women having children after the age of, say, 37, 38, and you would see an increase. But you don't at all. And people will be confused by that, because you might see in the media that, well, wait a minute, we're hearing that more and more women are becoming mothers after 40. Yeah, that's only because fewer and fewer women are becoming mothers at a younger age. So relatively, it looks like, oh, the percentage of people having children older than 40 is going up. Yeah, that's because the entire thing is going down. And it just looks like it's a little bit more prominent at that level. But if you stand back and look at entire societies over that time, this curve, vitality curve, really, there's no blip of any essence at all. So what does it mean? We know that children are being born from IVF. Why does it not show up in this curve? Well, the explanation to that, I think, it can only be that for every one person who successfully goes through IVF, bear with me here, I want to say this right. For every one person who succeeds, society as a whole has shifted delayed parenthood later, so that many more either didn't succeed or didn't even get to trying because they didn't have a partner, didn't have a life situation to be able to even get to the point of thinking about how, or having frozen their eggs, will never use them, just because their life is not engineered to around a partner. Most people do want partners to raise families with. The more focus you put on technologies like IVF, the fewer children will be born overall. The more you focus on later in life reproduction, good that is for those people who succeed, that the total number of babies born in that nation will go down. That's what the data supports. And then if you unravel that, you get to a slightly awkward position, for me at least, of saying, actually, we should be putting less light on things like egg freezing and IVF. Not that, of course, we want to have it. I'm not saying that for a second. But the focus needs to be taken away from those and on the broader risks of delayed parenthood, meaning unplanned childlessness, and the likelihood of lack of success of it working, but not just for technology. Even if IVF, let me say it this way, I haven't said it this way before. Even if IVF were perfect biologically, I believe that still overall births would go down, because most people are becoming childless these days, not because of biology at age 31, 35, whatever the age that they would have wanted their children. Childlessness happens for many reasons, circumstantial reasons, like not having a partner. People engineer their lives differently without children. The idea that, yes, sure, technically 100% likelihood I can have a child now at 45. I don't see many people age 45 saying, yeah, I'm ready now. I'm going to be a grandparent, and in my 90s, and I'm going to, suddenly look forward to changing diapers, 4 or 5 times a day. So IVF, I think, is a great technology, a miracle to many, but only in the context of truly understanding the true fertility window. And that's what we're not teaching young people at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Stephen J. Shaw, before we get to our last topic, where's the best place for people to look for you online?
Yeah. Please come to birthgap.org. You will find lots of information on there, certainly a bit more about me and my published research. You can link from that to a Patreon. So recently we now have a 10-episode version of the documentary if you don't want to watch the full thing. And I'm also launching some virtual watch party versions of the documentary where I will be watching along with people probably once a week or so. So come to birthgap.org and you can find all those good things there.
Excellent. We'll put links in the description for everyone to check out. And Stephen J. Shaw, last of all, we're talking about this curve and how it needs to move forward and all of this. Let's talk about things that can move it. And first of all, it seems pairing is a huge issue. So what do you notice working for people in dating and pairing in the first place, or what suggestions would you have?
Well, solutions is a very broad thing. And of course, I imagine people listening, watching this are saying, well, stop talking about the negatives and the past and talk about the future and how we get out of this. Pair bonding is a key, but you see there's an interesting corollary outcome of all this, which is that if it were the case in future that people were once again competing to have a partner and settle down younger, I believe pair bonding rates would naturally go up on their own. Imagine that dance hall that's now open 5 hours till midnight and really has lost its energy. Let's say they go back to the way it was. Things might change a little bit, but I think a lot of that energy would be brought back again. Might take a little time for people to adjust and say, wait a minute, this is different. We really need to kind of find that person's phone number earlier in the evening. So, staying with that analogy to just emphasize that point, let's say that club owner did reduce the hours to 3, let ballroom dancing club in your case, let's say. I don't think the club owner would have to tell people how to dance again, how to meet a partner, how to talk to someone. Not after the first few weeks anyway. It would happen naturally. So I don't think we need to worry too much about the pair bonding side if this is the huge if we can find a way to enable people to have children at a younger age. So we'll have to see in that one. It hasn't been done before. We don't know of any nation in history that's been able to come out of this. And there's plenty that arguably faded away because of this, going back to the Romans and potentially the Greeks. So you hear about baby bonuses, $5,000 for having a child. Well, $5,000 is probably very nice for people to kind of cover some of the costs, for having a child. But will increase the birth rates? Well, we've a lot of evidence from a lot of countries who've tried very similar things that absolutely won't. It probably will increase a blip, give a blip a little bit up. It may adjust things a little bit, but over time, baby bonuses have minimal impact. And there are certain studies that have shown that you can increase birth rates by 0.05 if you do this. Well, okay, nice. But we're talking of, an order of magnitude different, larger than that to have any meaningful impact. So finance alone, really, we know will work. And we do know, it's really established in the academic literature that wealth is inversely correlated with having children, unless you're super wealthy. Super wealthy people do tend to have more children, often it's the father who's married several times and had several families. But for the rest of us, the wealthier you are, the less likely you will have children, or the smaller families you will have overall. So people seem to think it's because of wealth, it's because of housing. All the things that we hear about are all important things. So take the cost of housing in certain areas. You go even within, obviously US, the UK, elsewhere, you go to areas that has lower cost housing. And you find birth rates even lower. So the idea that, well, if house rates, I know London quite well. A lot of people in London, where my family are, talk about the inability to get in the property ladder. That's a real challenge, I know. But you look at other parts like Scotland, where property is much more affordable, and Scotland's got lower birth rates. So it's not about just financial fixes to get out of this. Men should help more at the home, I hear. Sure. I'm not against that necessarily. I put my hand up for that one. But again, when we look at those nations like Scandinavia that have got better gender balance and all sorts of extended paternity leaves, and you look at birth rates in countries like Japan and Korea where they don't have those, they all suffer ultra low birth rates. Even Scandinavia is going through the same thing. So we can exclude things by just comparing countries. So it comes back to me again to what can we do to provide more stability to younger people, particularly women, to start a family. And there's one example I like to quote, which is Hungary, which gave several incentives for young people: a deposit to purchase a home based on family size, a short income tax credits there too, but I'm not sure that's the most important thing there. Another, forgiving student loans for women who started a family after college, I think within 2 years. So what we found in Hungary, the birth rate went up, it's settling back down a bit again, but we saw a bubble of younger people starting families in Hungary that we really haven't seen anywhere else. So that tells me, okay, it might be possible if we take the limelight away from focusing on later in life solutions like IVF and focus on, okay, how do we better protect younger people so that they can still get an education, so they can still pursue a career. But if things go wrong in life, career doesn't work out, there's a divorce, it happens. That vulnerability, which is in people's minds, particularly women, is kind of taken away to say, even if things go wrong, that, the community, the society is going to help me figure it out.
Yeah. Well, Stephen J. Shaw, for distilling this all down to help us understand these concepts like the vitality curve, for packaging it in such a compelling documentary, and for taking this interview with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.